So once we've connected to the microcontroller and successfully logged in, you will end up on the landing page or the welcome page. You will see on the top menu here that you have a couple of options as to where to navigate to. The first one I'm going to show you is under System Information. If you open up the information page, it's just going to present you with specific information pertaining to the microcontroller in question. Now the first section here, hardware, it's for most users they probably won't find this all that interesting, but if you're a developer it's going to be useful for you to know exactly how much memory you have on the actual device. These ESP controllers come out with 4 megs of memory, which is a lot, and it's running at 40 megahertz. You can also see the Wi-Fi channel that you're using. Under System, you will have the amount of memory that's available. Obviously, if you start running scripts on it, it's going to consume some memory, so that's just an indication of how much memory you have available. Also, in terms of the maximum file lengths and so forth, more in terms of from a programming perspective. But if you don't need it, just don't pay attention to that. What is important for most users though would be the block on the right hand side, the microcontroller scripting and security. In a separate tutorial we will cover the scripts, but you can see there's no script currently running, and it's also not configured to start up automatically. Login required, yes. After the information page I will show you how you can disable the security if it's not required, as well as additional services like Mqtt brokers. If you're not familiar with Mqtt, it's just a protocol. It's very popular, especially in terms of communication for home automation purposes, but we will cover Mqtt and scripting in a separate tutorial. Also important will be the connectivity section. Here you will see the SSID, or the name of the microcontroller, as you can remember, with the last 4 characters being unique. And as you can see, there's the MAC address. You see that it ends on C38C, and so I wasn't lying, actually, it was indeed the last 4 characters. The own IP address, and then Wi-Fi client status. It's not currently connected to any external network, so these fields are empty. And NTP time we'll get to in a bit. On the right hand side we have current connected clients, so you see there's an IP address of 77.100. that is actually this iPad. After we connected it to the microcontroller, the DHCP service running on the microcontroller then automatically assigned the IP address of 77.100. If you can remember correctly, the IP address of the module itself is 77.1. And then the last block here is just a list of detected access points. So if you're going to use this microcontroller to connect to an external router or some other network, you might find its name in this list, and it's just for information purposes, so that when you get to the settings page you can actually just relay that information over there. As you can see, we have the infamous "you don't mess with a Zoan" SSID in this list as well, probably from one of my creative neighbors. So that it is for the information page. Next we can go to the settings page. Just want to explain what settings look like. So the first section here is in terms of security. As you can see, it's asking whether explicit security should be enabled. And on the right hand side you have user credentials. So now you can change your username and your password. You just need to type the password twice to make sure you don't accidentally mistype it. But if you don't need the security, you can just disable it altogether. So if I say save, settings was updated, and as you can see that section is gone now because security is no longer needed. So the next time when we restart the microcontroller, let me just say all these settings that you do here obviously are persistent, so the settings are being stored in memory, and after each and every restart these settings will still be present. So even after an upgrade, if you reload the firmware, the settings that you have now will always remain intact. So security was disabled. Now if we restart the microcontroller, it's not going to take us back to the login screen. Instead, we're going to go immediately to the welcome screen. In terms of connectivity, this warrants some explanation. These are the various Wi-Fi options, connectivity options that you have. The first one, as you can see, is grayed out. We don't want to disable the Wi-Fi on this device because it's the only means of communication. But the second option is station mode. Station mode means that it's a client to another access point. So if you have DSL or a router or something in your house, you can use this microcontroller and you can connect to that access point by setting it as a station. Currently it's set as an access point, but if you want, you could also set it to being both a station and an access point. If you do that, for example, you will still be able to connect your phone or your laptop to this microcontroller, but at the same time it will connect to your existing infrastructure that you have in your house, for example. Now, the reason why I selected station and access point was just to go through all the settings quickly. Ntp Server Settings. This is network time protocol. So some of you might be familiar with it. It's in essence just a way for the microcontroller to sync its internal time with that of an external server. Now, the Ntp Server Settings, obviously it's only available if you connect this microcontroller to an external router. So if you set it to be a station. If you set it as an access point only, there's no way for it to communicate with anything outside, on the internet, for example, so you won't be able to sync it with an Ntp server. You might say that, you see a little clock there at the bottom, but for those of you who are familiar with programming and programming concepts, that time is being provided by JavaScript, which is client-side scripting. So any device connecting or opening up this page will generate that time. However, all the code that's running in the background on the microcontroller is server-side not scripting, it's server-side language in C++. Now, if you have connected a sensor to this microcontroller, for example, and you want periodic readings on time and humidity, on temperature and humidity, for example, you would like to store those results on the microcontroller against a certain timestamp. Otherwise, you might see that the temperature was too high, but you don't know what the time was. So in order to make sure that the internal time is correct, you can use the Ntp Server Settings here just to get the time from the internet. Now, by default, it will work. You can see it's getting its time from pool.ntp.org, which is an international organization where you can sync your Ntp clients from. And it's not costing you anything, obviously. The GMT time zone, which you can set as just the actual time zone which you're at. If you're GMT -10, you just set it to -10 in that case. The page obviously is designed in such a way that it will only accept valid values. If you put anything outside of the acceptable range, it will warn you before you can update the settings. Daylight savings, if you have this, thank goodness we don't have daylight savings, it's terrible, but you can set it, as well as the refresh time in 63 seconds. Every 63 seconds it will check the Ntp server and it will update its time if required, or just make sure that it's still in sync. If you don't need it to check every 63 seconds, you can set it to 3600 seconds, check once every hour, or it really doesn't matter how you set this up. It's however you need it. Local wireless settings. For the local wireless settings, it refers to the microcontroller itself. So if it states access point name, it's the name of the microcontroller. As you can see, Quantagenix C38C. Of course, now you have the opportunity to change it, make it more meaningful for you, as well as the password, which you just need to type in again twice, and then the IP address, which you can change to any other IP you may need. Do bear in mind that if you set this up as a station, it's going to get an IP address from the router. So the IP address that you set here is only for the access point services, not for the local connection or the private connection. The remote wireless settings, this refers to the private connection I just mentioned. This, in that first block, router SSID, this is where you need to set the name of your external router. So mine is called Cadaver in this case. It's not as funny as you don't mess with the Zoan, but just type the SSID in there, once again the password twice, and update the settings, and after a microcontroller restart it will automatically connect to the to the router in question. So I don't want the access point services anymore. I'm just going to set it as a station. So set station, and as you can see, the local wireless settings have disappeared, but we still have the remote wireless settings. Also, just bear in mind that for each and every block, it's being treated as separate. So when you make changes inside a block, please just click the update button underneath it, just to make sure that you're saving each and every one of these sections. So we already have a router SSID set up. So when this microcontroller restarts now, we change the station mode. So after a restart, it's not going to be available on this IP address anymore, because it's not going to be an access point. Instead, it's going to connect to my local infrastructure, and I will be able to connect to it through the IP address that my router has assigned to it. Just moving on a little bit more. This is for Mqtt Services, and I mentioned that we will cover this in a separate tutorial. But if you do need Mqtt Services, you can enable it here. Please do note that this microcontroller is not an Mqtt server. So it runs a Mqtt client. So you can publish to an Mqtt server, or you can subscribe to topics that's available on the Mqtt server. But in order to run an Mqtt server, you will need a small little server, something like a Raspberry Pi, or one of our modules that runs on the Orange Pi, for example. They are capable of hosting an Mqtt or Mosquito broker service by running on Linux. So if you have enabled Mqtt support, on the right hand side you have the option now to specify the IP address. The IP address can be any IP as long as it's accessible from where you've plugged in the microcontroller. The default topic name, when we get into scripting, I will show you how you can subscribe to different topics, but in this case this is just the default topic name. So when the microcontroller starts up the first time and it connects to Mqtt Services, it's going to publish on that topic saying that I am online and I'm ready to start reading topics and publishing to other topics. If you do require security for Mqtt, you can just specify it there, and once again you're going to need to specify a username and a password for authentication against the Mqtt server. Please bear in mind that if you're not using Mqtt, please do not enable these options. The microcontroller will still work, but you will find that it takes significantly longer for it to start up, because it's going to try and authenticate and try and connect to the Mqtt server for say 10 or 15 seconds, and finally when it sees that it can't reach the server, it will go into a slow retry cycle, and the microcontroller will start up and it will check say every 30 seconds to make sure the Mqtt server is back up. Also worthy of notice, of mention at least, is the fact that we've set it now as a station mode, which means the access point services are no longer available. So if the router that it's connecting to for some reason is not available anymore, it means that we won't be able to connect to this microcontroller at all. But fortunately, we've already built in a subroutine that will, if it continuously fails to connect to a particular router, it will revert back to its access point services. So if you lose your router, or the lightning kills it, or something bad happens, someone carries it away, you will still be able to use your microcontroller. Just plug it in, start it up, and after a couple of seconds it will see that it can't connect, and it will start up the access point services again, to which you will then connect and use the username and password you set before you disabled the access point services, which was these settings over here. And then of course the very last option here is just to restart the microcontroller. And as you can see, it took a little bit longer to start up now, and it's because it first connected to our external router. So you'll see if we try to refresh this page now, it's not going to work anymore because the access point doesn't exist anymore. We go to Wi-Fi, you will see that it's not in the list anymore, despite the fact that the microcontroller is indeed running. The way in which we can access it now is via the local IP address. So if you have difficulty obtaining the IP address for your microcontroller now, you're more than welcome just to post me a comment, and I'll see how I can assist you in getting the IP address. But for all of you fiddling with your routers, you should be familiar with how it works by now. I can, for example, say that I know my router's IP address 50.1, and now if I type in my password, and I go to interface LAN, it will show you a list of all the current connected devices. And I haven't changed the name of mine yet, so as you can see, that's C38C. It's got the IP address of 5028. So if I open up a new tab and I say 192.168.50.28, it's going to open up the web services again. Just bear in mind 2 changes now. It's not going to present us with a login because we disabled that, and we're going to go to not backspace, we're going to go to the welcome landing page immediately. And now if you open up the information page, for example, and you scroll down to connectivity, you will see that own IP address is a bunch of zeros now, and Wi-Fi client status says connected. It shows you to which router it's connected, and it shows you also the IP address that it's obtained from the router, as well as the Ntp Services, which is synchronizing the internal clock. Also, current connected clients, there's nothing in that list anymore because it's not an access point anymore. The list of detected access points will remain as before.